the car. Right?
Right. Okay, good afternoon. So we're going to get started here. So what we're going to do today is we're going to cover the rest of the material dealing with cost of production. And I think the chapter of perfect competition, even though I had maybe thought I would get to that in this particular segment of the class, I don't know that we're going to, mostly because I want to spend most of the time today talking about this dynamic and this interplay between marginal and average. Talking about what that looks like, and then I've sort of recreated the spreadsheet that I guess not really a spreadsheet, but I guess it's an original old school spreadsheet on the whiteboard. And I know that we had some issues, and it was totally unforeseen to me because it's the only other whiteboard we have in here. It looks like the projector was sort of in the way of the camera, and I didn't see that coming. I don't know that anybody saw that one. So I may take a screenshot of that and just send that to everybody, or post it on the course site or something. If you can't see it, and I'll have to see what that view looks like as we get over to scrolling to see that. So it was just one of those things that, the data anymore is a fairly new concept, I guess. And because of that, I don't think anybody foresaw that might interfere. We do have limited board space. That is one of the drawbacks, and it's particularly a drawback in this particular part of the class. Now, I don't know that it's going to be that big of a deal as we go forward, particularly as we get into market structure, and as we get into some of the market structure is sort of the third segment after we take this second example. It's going to be that big of an issue as we go forward. But for this, we just kind of need to spread out so we can show everything, show these relationships, how they work together. And to me, I think it's important because one of the things about econ that I have long known or realized is that it really is difficult to sort of turn people loose sometimes with just a textbook and say, here, read a book, take a test, and all that. I think it's that there's some extra explanation in online classes. I have videos that I post just to sort of walk through some of these things so that we can see what all is going on. We definitely have independent study courses, don't get me wrong, but I do think econ is one of those courses that probably works better with some explanation. So, all right, so we talked last time about fixed cost and variable cost, and remember what fixed costs were. And we said, if inputs create costs, so just remember this very basic idea, if inputs create costs, then fixed inputs create fixed costs. And what are some examples of those fixed costs that we talked about last time? Anybody remember what some of those examples were? Like lease expense, salaries, could be interest, could be insurance. These are things that are not tied to the production of output. So in other words, they're not what we call non-ABC costs. So there's activity-based costs. They're not tied to the production of output. So as a result, we simply say that they're there. And they're going to be there for your output or 1 million units or 10 million units or whatever. Now we said that as we grow, these inputs have to change also. And so as a result, the inputs are sort of what we call lumpy. That is, if you are building a new building, you have to have a whole new building. It's not, you can't build 1/38 of a building, some fraction of a building, or one portion of a manager. You got to go all the way. So as a result, you have to step up to the next level of fixed costs. And so we say something that's very important, that is all costs are variable in the long run. And the long run in microeconomics is pretty well defined as being the time it takes for all inputs to be able to be changed. Okay, what the time frame is. Time it takes for all inputs to be changed around. So as a result, in the short run, it's the time it takes where there cannot be any change in the fixed inputs. You can change variable inputs like labor and materials, and those may change on a daily basis, frankly. But the fixed inputs, not so much. Okay. So we talked a bit about what those were about. And so now what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the relationship here between fixed and variable costs. And I want to introduce the concept of this here. So we talked a bit about averages before, and I talked about it really in the context of this idea of some of the interplay between marginals and averages. But I said that averages are a bit problematic, but they're not that problematic. And so let's talk a bit about what's going on with averages. Okay, so let me see here. So I'm swiveled the camera over here. So remember that we have two kinds of costs, fixed and variable costs, okay? And I'm going to, before we leave today, I will opportunity cost and economic and accounting profit. That'll be the last thing I do. Hopefully, I say hopefully because I hope I get to there. But if all costs are composed of fixed and variable costs, then what about variables? Well, variable cost is this. There is an average, or averages, I mean. Average fixed cost is the idea of fixed cost over total product. If total product is on this axis here, and again, I sort of put the denominations right here. And the reason I put a dollar sign here is because as we get going in the class, we're going to be sort of overlaying the idea of revenue and cost together. So I can't really say cost is on this axis. I can't say revenue is on this axis. I can't say profit is on this axis alone, but all of those share the same denomination in terms of dollars. And everything on this axis is in terms of numbers. And that's sort of a common methodology that we use in economics everywhere. So remember, if we talked about this idea that fixed costs are lumpy, we can start out with FC1, and then at some point we take a jump or step upward to FC2. Okay, so FC2 is this. And at some point we take another jump or step upward to some FC3. Well, what do we got going on here with regard to the nature of fixed costs? So first of all, what is an average? Again, we're only taking the arithmetic mean, that is just the simple average. We're not weighting anything, we're just taking simply total values over the total observations. That's all we're really doing. And again, whenever you have a dollar figure, multiplied or divided by a number, you're going to end up with some dollar figure. Always, always, always. It's going to be the same case in all cases here. Okay, so it's going to be a dollar figure divided by a number. It's going to end up in a dollar figure. So that's important well, I think we know that. I think we know costs are represented in dollar figures. But let's take this. Let's say fixed costs, or let's say that the output is changing. And so at fixed cost 1, let's say it's $1,000, and at fixed cost 2, it's $10,000, and at fixed cost 3, it's $100,000, right? All those are simply jumps or steps upward as we go up over time, okay? And as the quantity changes, then the fixed costs are going to change as well. And so we absorb, what happens is basically this, that these fixed costs are going to change, but they're going to change in the long run, okay? But the long run may be a very long time, right? This may be a very, very long time period where we could go a few years at fixed cost 1, fixed cost 2, fixed cost 3. It does take a while for a firm to grow. And how does it grow? It grows its sales, that is revenue. And we haven't really gotten into that, only other than just simply really to define what revenue is. We said if costs are the value of inputs, then revenue are the value of the outputs. And so we're going to bring that in, probably not so much today, but it's going to come up definitely in the next chapter.
And TP means total
product. Total product. It's sort of analogous to quantity that we talked about before. It's not quite the same, but I usually put a little squiggly saying it's roughly the same as quantity. So total product is roughly the same as quantity. And I can't remember in the OpenStax book if they use total product or quantity. It doesn't really make any difference. It should be obvious from looking at it what it is. It's the total amount of production. So over whatever the time period is, this could be a long time period here. So one of the things that is challenging in economics is trying to model something over very long time periods because we have to explain why these are changing over time. And we don't really have like a time axis. If we did, we'd have a third axis and we could go through the board and all that on a third dimension. And that's some software allows you to do that, but obviously we don't. We're not quite there yet with that situation. Okay, so let's do this. Let's just say that we're going to this is a long run proposition. Let's just say that we're going to start with this idea of 1,000 units right now. Okay, and we're going to describe what is going on here with this. And so right now the only issue is we've got fixed cost, and fixed cost are 1,000. Okay, $1,000. Whatever, a year or a month doesn't matter as long as we are dividing by the same production in the same time frame. So if this is a monthly figure, this has got to be a monthly figure. If this is annual, this has got to be annual. Okay. So what about some different levels of output here? And let's just say we've got. Let's say we start with some fairly low level of output here. Let's say 1,000 units, and let's say we go up to let's say 10,000 units and 100,000 units. Okay, 100,000 units of output. Okay, so what goes on here? So what is the calculation here? Fixed cost is fixed cost over total product. So let's say this. Now we've got total product 1, and we'll call that TP1 here. And we're not changing the We're not changing the fixed cost because we're simply looking at it here in the short run, okay? And TP3. So TP1 is basically what? Fixed cost, which is 1,000 divided by TP1, which is, I'm sorry, TP1, which is 1,000, right? So yeah, 1,000. So it's equal to 1. I'm sorry, that's kind of scrunched over there a little bit. So you've got a value of 1, okay? All right, so what if we increase our amount of production here? And actually, let me start from the other direction, because I think it might be a little bit easier if we start from a different direction. And we say, well, no, that's right. We could do that. Let's keep it where it is. 1,000 divided by 1,000 is 1. It doesn't really matter. And then we have a different figure here. We've got fixed cost over total product 2, and that's 1,000 now over 10,000. Okay. And what does that come out to be? This is, again, per unit, fixed cost per unit, right? It should be, that's right. And I know it's a fairly, we're sort of squeezed in there a little bit. And if you have fixed cost over total product 3, then we've got now 100,000 as the denominator, and we've still got the same 1,000, and it should be 1 cent. And let me put it down here because I know this is the limitation we've got here with board space. So what have you got going on here? You've got a decline over time in this thing going on here. And so what can we say then about the average fixed cost, right? This is average fixed cost at point 1, average fixed cost at point 2, and average fixed cost at point 3. We're saying it declines. And so as a result, what have you got going on here? You've got a fixed cost curve that looks average fixed cost curve that looks something like that. Okay, it just declines over time. And you can plug the values in. You can plug $1 in here. You can plug 10 cents in here, in here. This is not maybe drawn to scale, but you kind of get the idea as to what's going on. In other words, it goes down over time. And why does it go down over time? This is really the beauty of fixed costs, particularly in the short run. And that is, as you produce more output, the fixed cost portion of total cost goes down. So this is why we have very big firms that produce lots and lots of output. That is, as this number goes up, then at least the fixed cost portion is going down. And if fixed costs are a very large proportion of total costs, then it means that your cost per unit in the fixed cost element. This is why some firms that produce just vast amounts of output, it doesn't cost them very much to produce that. This is really one of the reasons why it doesn't make sense to produce a lot of the goods that we buy in stores and department stores on our own. What does make sense to produce them on our own? We might as well just go buy them because somebody else is producing them a lot more, better, cheaper, and faster, and that's what they specialize in. And it doesn't cost them much to do it. And I think I used the example of somebody I knew who made her own soap, and it took her the better part of an afternoon. You're talking about an output item that's worth, I don't know, what, $1 per bar of soap or whatever. And but she wasn't doing it for an economic purpose. She was just doing it because she wanted to do it. But if she were, that wouldn't make a lot of sense. She would certainly earn a wage of $1 in not much time at all, right? Just a fraction of an hour instead of most of the afternoon. So this is really the beauty of this whole thing. And this downward slope here has got a particular term, and it comes up again and again in finance in particular. It's called operating leverage. Operating leverage is this idea, and why is it called leverage? Well, leverage is the ability to use something to your benefit. And there's another kind of leverage. When you hear it in finance, for those of you who take accounting and finance, you may hear the term leverage, and it may refer more to debt. And that's a different kind of leverage. That's what we call financial leverage or balance sheet leverage. But this is simply from a cost perspective. And all you're doing is you're leveraging off of whatever the fixed costs, the fixed inputs are in order to produce more and more and more output, because they're already there. They're not going anywhere. And if you can get an opportunity to produce a little bit more output, you'll probably take it, because this portion of cost, this fixed cost portion goes down over time. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing that goes down over time, because as you produce more output, you're going to drive that portion of it down. So it's leverage in the sense it's just like, think of a lever with, so that maybe the original way that we've ever heard the description of a lever is that you use something, some sort of tool, very big. And this is, you're moving something very big here, and that's output, and you're using a tool, fixed cost, or the fixed inputs in particular, to get that tool done, that big amount of output. And you can do it. That's why we call it operating leverage. Operating usually refers to something at the production level, at the the short-term level, the sort of the income making sort of level of the business, not really dealing with some of the bigger picture items like, balance sheets and debts and stocks and all that. So, okay, so that's the issue with regard to that. And these figures can be very small. You're thinking, what, a penny per unit? Well, yeah, it could be. It could easily be that the fixed cost per unit of something like, I don't know, a roll of paper towels, maybe the fixed cost portion may be just a penny because they produce so many of them. And the equipment has been around forever, and they just keep using it. And the fixed costs are maybe pretty small as a result. And so this operating leverage really works to your advantage. This is why people don't make their own goods for the most part. They buy them from others. This is the benefit of trade, is the idea that somebody can ramp up and produce more output and drive the cost down. Now, obviously, I go back to the issue I talked about at the outset, and that was the idea that these fixed costs will change in the long run, but the long run can be a very long time period. So this is the short run, and it's simply defined, the short run is simply defined as the period in which there's no alteration, there's no adjustment in the inputs. And because there's no adjustment in the inputs, there's no adjustment in the fixed cost. The variable costs will change, and they change in both the short run. If they change in the short run, they definitely change in the long run. But we know that about variable costs. We know what variable costs do, they change. So remember what the fixed costs are in the examples of those, with things like salaries, rents, lease expense on things like equipment. It could be interest, it could be insurance, it could be a lot of things. It really depends on what you want to dump into that. You may not want to include some of these financial costs like interest and whatnot, because they're really not that closely tied to the operation of the business. And so that's fine. You have got all that freedom in the world to put what you want in here. All I'm simply saying is that would not be a variable cost. But you may want to exclude it just so that you can determine the amount of operating leverage. Variable costs include things like that are directly tied to the output of the business. Here, you wouldn't even consider including things like interest and stock dividends and all that. You would instead focus on things like labor, that is direct labor, not salaries. Remember the workers who earn salaries are supervisors and managers and professional staff. They typically are at a fixed wage, regardless of how many hours they work or how much output they produce. Sometimes they get paid during holidays, sometimes they don't. Usually they do. Firms, particularly, as I talked about this last time, firms that do things that are really dirty and gross will close down for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever, and clean everything. And the manager will probably get paid. And certainly the landlords will get paid and all that, but not the variable cost element that's not being employed. There's no materials being used. There's no variable portion of the overhead like lights and whatnot. And I know we can get very detailed into what variable costs could get dumped into that. And for those of you who will take cost accounting at some point, you'll get more than your share of that. But you get, or even managerial accounting, which is sort of the lead into that. You'll get into that. So that's what's going on there. Operating leverage is this idea that you can drop down that total amount of fixed cost over time as you produce more output. Okay? So fixed and variable do matter. So if that's the definition of average fixed cost, then what about variable cost? And what is going on in one of the variable cost elements? So I'm going to leave this up here, and I broke out here what average variable cost is. Variable cost is variable cost divided by total product. Okay, and this is going to change, and all these are going to be enumerated in dollar figures. And so what I want to do here with variables is this, and I want to introduce something I think I may have talked about, but I did not certainly elaborate in a very big way. And that's the sort of interplay between the marginal and the average. Okay, between the marginal and the average. Now you might remember that we talked about the marginal product curve before as looking something like this, and it was downward sloping, and we said that it was a diminishing function. And remember, we first started to talk about diminishing functions back in 6, and we said that diminishing functions in general mean that you get less and less benefit from something as you do more of it. And it's just like going to the gym. The first hour, you get a lot of benefit. The second hour, positive benefit, but maybe not so much. And maybe you could even be negative hours or whatever. That's just an analogy, or anything, a cups of coffee or whatever. Well, the same, and we talked about this interplay between marginal product and marginal cost. And we said that if you flip marginal cost to the screen here, you basically, oops, things did, isn't it? So you basically end up with a marginal cost curve that looks something like this. And you might see this if you were to Google this, you might see all kinds of configurations. But one thing you will see is that there will be sort of a dip here. And this is really due to this early stage gain in productivity by adding inputs. I used an example last time of a store in which you had one worker, and what was that worker's job? The worker's job was everything: answering the phone, sweeping the floor, waiting on customers, going to the post office, doing everything, right? And then if you add another worker, then you got somebody else to maybe do things like answer the phone and wait on customers while the other one does other things. Add another worker, you get more productive. But over time, you begin to add so many workers, you become less productive on the margin. And we talked about this idea of diminishing marginal product. And I sort of went, I think I have it on this screen here. And what on this spreadsheet I'll reproduce here in a minute. And I think I'm going to put dollar figures to that, but that's simply the issue of numbers going down over time. Well, how does that look like from a cost standpoint? Those are numbers, these are dollars, marginal cost goes up over time. You get this little early stage benefit, and then marginal cost goes over time. All right, so what about this connection then to variable cost, and where does that fit in here? So my average variable cost basically looks something like this. And we're going to something to write down here, and that's a very important concept. And it kind of goes back to the example that I gave of a batting average or a grade point average or whatever. And we said that the grade point average is a marginal per semester performance, but the grade point average that shows up on your grade report over time goes all the way back, right? All the way back to the very beginning. And so we're saying that the marginal drives the average. Or the baseball player who can't move the batting average late in the season because there's just so many observations, so many numbers in the denominator going all the way back to the first game back in April. Now by October, he can't move the batting average very much. Even if he in a perfect record in every game for the next couple of games, he'll move it, but it won't move it very much.
But what are we talking about? The average cost, the average?
Average anything. Average anything. Okay. The marginal drives the average. And this is a general concept everywhere. It's margin. And we don't really get into average revenue very much, or average profit. If you take further econ courses, you might. Instead, we're mostly talking about cost here, but will drive every average. And when I say it drives it, it pushes it in one way or the other. And so as a result, think about what average variable cost looks like. It's being dragged down by marginal. Who's dead too? So I guess it's good that I'm learning what works and what doesn't here. So okay, so this dragged down by marginal cost until the intersection here. Okay, and then as marginal cost continues on its way up, then average variable cost will make its way up. And so average variable cost looks like this. It's sort of concave upward, sort of U-shaped. Sometimes you might see those referred to as a U-shaped. Sort of a U-shaped curve. But the key thing to know is the slope here is zero. The slope here is zero because this is the intersection point. And then as we produce more output, the average variable cost is being dragged along by the marginal cost. It's being dragged upward. In other words, it's driving it. Just like the idea that if you had a grade point average of 3.5 and you get one semester where your grade report is a 3.9, then that's going to push that 3.5 upward. But if the next semester you don't do quite as well, and you get a 2.5, then it's going to drive it down. It's not going to drive it really far down, and particularly if it's very late in the game, that is very late with more observations, because the marginal doesn't drive the average that much over time, but it will drive it, okay? It will drive it. That's an important thing to keep in mind. So the marginal drives the average. So you get this sort of downward slope here. You get this benefit of these early stage implementation, whatever the input is, because remember, costs are the value of inputs, and there's more, but there's more being employed, then you've got an issue where the cost is going up. So the marginal cost is dragging up the average variable cost. Okay? All right, so that's an important thing for us to sort of keep in mind. Now I want to turn to something we haven't talked about yet, but is related to this, and it's not really that complex at all. And it's this: it's the idea of total cost, and what are we doing with this idea of total cost? Well, all right. So what is total cost? Total cost is fixed cost plus variable cost. Well, then what on earth is average total cost, right? So we've got average fixed cost, average variable cost, and average total cost. Average total cost is simply the total cost divided by total product, or Q, whichever you prefer. Total product Q is the same thing, okay? It's total cost over total product. In other words, this is what we would refer to as unit cost. So if somebody says, what is the cost per unit? They're usually talking about that. They're usually not talking about the marginal cost. In fact, marginal cost is really more of an economics term. You probably won't see it or come across it very much if you work in the accounting area or finance. You may in finance a little bit. We do the marginals there, but it's really more of an economics concept. But it's a real concept. I mean, we can definitely track marginal costs and then marginal benefits that go on the opposite side. But when we talk about something like what does it cost to produce a 747, this is what we would be referring to. That is the total cost divided by unit. So if it's one 747 and it costs, I don't know, $100 million or whatever, it's 100 million over one, which is $100 million. That's what it takes. If you could do that for two 747s, it's $50 million. I have no idea what it costs to build a 747. In fact, I think they're done making them, but I mean, what does it cost to make that unit? And that's unit cost, okay? That's unit cost over time. So how does this then relate back to these guys? If fixed cost plus variable cost equals total cost, then we can say that average fixed cost plus average variable cost equals average total cost. And so that's an important relationship. So you've got two different calculations, but one's not like a hack or anything to get to another. They're both really in relationship. It's just that they're expressed in a little bit of a different way. Because you could simply break these out and say fixed cost over total product plus variable cost over total product equals average fixed cost. Average total product. And you can simply wipe out the denominators all the way because they cancel themselves out. So as a result, average total cost equals total cost over total product. And that is the unit cost. Okay? So this is an important thing to think about. The cost per unit and the fixed cost element, which goes down, down, down over time. I guess I could kind of draw that here, couldn't I? If I'm able to. And average fixed cost would come in somewhere like this, right? And by the way, this is not, it's not being driven here. This is one average that is not being driven by the marginal because of the fact it's independent. Because it doesn't relate to the amount of output being produced, it has no bearing whatsoever. So in this case, the marginal doesn't really make any difference at all to that average fixed cost, but that's the only one that doesn't make any difference too, because here's the thing. If average fixed cost and average variable cost look like this, and it's important that we realize this goes down, down, down over time. And what does average total cost look like? Average total cost looks, I'll make this big so you can see it, like something like that. And we'll simply call it average total cost right there. And notice the thing that I tried to do in maybe an exaggerated fashion is I've tried to make this corridor between average total cost and average variable cost as little as possible. Because why? Because what is that difference? In other words, remember how it's a word problem in algebra, right? So what is the difference between average total cost and average variable cost, right? In other words, if you subtract the two of those, it's average fixed cost. So what we've got going on here is the width of this corridor here is equal to the width of that corridor here, because this goes down, this average fixed cost element goes down. So all this unit here is average fixed cost, which will change as output increases. And I know this is a little busy. This is why I say this particular chapter is the most complicated chapter of the book. And it's really just a matter of sort of grasping the relationships and the interplay between these values as they work with each other, okay? So average fixed cost goes down over time. And so the difference between, if you still think about it, what's the difference between ATC and ABC? It's got to be AFC. And so that's the portion of that goes down. So this corridor here just kind of goes down, down, down over time. And it may be where, if it's like the example I gave you here, where if it's a penny, average fixed cost per unit is a penny, you may have almost no difference in ATC and AVC, but they'll never be the same if there's any amount of fixed cost at all. And I don't know any organization that has no fixed inputs at all. In other words, no fixed cost. I can't imagine what it would be. The only thing I can think of is if you've got some area where all the workers are working for profit sharing, and there's no wage being paid. I don't know where that would happen, where there's no building rent. I can't think of where that would even happen. Maybe the building is owned. All the workers are working for a portion of the profits. I just can't imagine where there's no fixed cost. And in fact, it almost doesn't make sense. And in fact, one of the things that we talk about in the finance world is that a business has got to have some assets in order to generate some return. You need some, usually it's something of a technology nature, really, frankly. So that's what's going on here. So any questions about that? Maybe you have a lot of questions. I don't know, but are there questions about what that relationship is all about? It's a little bit busy, I realize that, but it's really a key relationship as to how we sort of break out these relationships between marginals and averages, particularly in terms of cost. And so the thing I want to do here, if I'm trying to turn my camera on here, I want to try to now, I'm going to have everybody in the room swivel over to the left here, because I sort of want to recreate using the same numbers I started with before. And I'm going to get cut off here anyway. And I wish I had thought that I cut off mostly the left side. See if I can adjust this a little bit. I think that's as good as I'm going to do. I'll try to take some sort of screenshot here to try to make this a little bit better. And I apologize because we're simply using what we've got to work with here. So, okay, so, all right. Again, I'll shoot a picture of this after class. After you guys leave, I'll go ahead and make copies of this and give it. Let's get back over here. Apologize for making you swivel, but it is. So here we got inputs. So basically, costs are the value of inputs. All this is really, you can simply call this a cost table, input table, however you want to refer to it. We've got quantity of labor. Again, this is fairly simple number of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Total product, and these are the same values that we worked with last week on the table, in which the first use of it was to create a reckoning of what the marginal product of labor was. Now you can have quantity of labor, quantity of capital goods, like machines or equipment. And one of the examples I gave last week was a car wash, where the labor input was self-explanatory, but the capital input were these production lines that go through and spray your car and put soap and wax on your car. You can do that, but I just sort of simplified this. So total product goes up, and notice the marginal of that total product will go down 4, 6. Goes up to 3, 1, 3, 2, 1, that sort of thing. Fixed costs are going to be the same. Remember, they don't vary in the short run. Variable costs will change over time. Okay? And so total cost is simply what? Total cost is simply column 3 plus column 4, right? It's simply fixed costs plus variable cost. That's the same formula we have over there. Okay, column 3 plus column 4. So it's 25 plus 0 is 25, 50, 75. Pretty straightforward. I did not want to make the math overly onerous because it's not really, this is not math. Math is used, but it's really sort of an effort to try to get us to look at what's going on here. Okay. So the marginals, we don't have a lot of choice here. It's going to get a little bit trickier. And here what we've got going on is this. Marginal cost, remember, is the change in total cost, not about the change in. In other words, you've got the change in column 5 from change in column 2. So here, let's just simply do the math here. We've got change in total cost, which is 50 minus 25, over change in total product, which is 4 minus 0. As a result, you get what? You get 25 over 4. I'm going to have to move these columns here. I'll move these columns. Okay, and so you're going to end up with a value of 6.25. 6.25 what? $6.25. Right? Okay, and you can go down here, and I'll do a little more, and just to kind of show you how we arrive at it. It's basically the change 50 minus 25 minus 4 minus 0. Okay, and now we go to 75 minus 50. Okay, 75 minus 50, over 10 minus 4. Okay, simply changing column 5 by the change in column 2. In other words, remember that all these delta symbols are simply new minus old. So this is now the new total cost, 75, not 50. This is the new output, 10, not 4. And so now you end up with 25 over 6, which is 4.70. So 470. Okay? Well, notice marginal cost is falling. Okay, we would expect that to happen, right? We would expect that to happen. Let's move on to the next set of values here, where we have now it's 100 minus 75 over 13 minus 10, which is now 25 over 3, which is 833. So now look, it's going up. This is what we expected to see happen. We get this early stage gain in productivity as we employ more units of labor. In this case, labor is our only input, and you know, obviously in the real world, you probably would have some capital input, as I talked about a minute ago, but for the most part, it's just makes our analysis a little bit easier. 833, etc. Okay, and then let me just do the math. We only got two more simple calculations: 125 minus 100 over 15 minus 13, so it's 25 over 2, which is 1250. Notice the marginal. Okay. And then one final calculation. And again, we sort of put it in a half step with marginal values. You don't always, you might see it on the landing page, on the landing line here. It's oftentimes sort of set at a half step, just in order to, you know, note that marginal cost is changing as we go from one increment level to the next. It is from this level to this level to this level. So, okay. And the final one is 150 minus 125 all over 16 minus 15. That's divided by 1 is itself, and so you get 25 over 1, which is $25. Okay. So as a result, you get the marginal cost curve going up over time. Okay, so it looks a lot like that fishing, right? So 6.5 goes down a little bit, goes up, down, above, flat. Okay, so that's the connection between total product, total cost, and the marginal cost. The marginal cost is the value that divides it. It's the divisor, okay? Quotient, I guess. All right, so now what we need to do is we just simply put final three columns and average fixed cost, average variable cost, average total cost, okay? Then we'll finish out this spreadsheet. So what do we got going on here? So average fixed cost is always then fixed cost over total. Okay, fixed cost over total. Over here, fixed cost is always going to be 25. Every single numerator, it's called 3 divided by column 2. Right? Column 3 divided by column 2. 25 divided by 0 is 75. So I will simply leave that as a blank. 25 divided by 4 units is 625. So we'll put that there. And we put dollar figures, but we don't really need to, as long as we understand what we are doing. So now let's move to the level of 2 units of output here. And so now you've got total of 50 now divided by, I'm sorry, 25 divided by 10. 25 divided by 10 minutes to 50. So notice what is happening. The average fixed cost is going down, isn't it? That's what we anticipated in our graph over there. Okay? So that's 0, 1, 2, let's do 3, 4, and 5 here. And so what we got going on here, we've got, I'll simply do the math and sort of go 92. At 4 units, then come down here. I'm kind of a little off the line here. That's 6. I'll move this up a little bit here just for get that down. You should, we don't get too off line. This is I can take all the lines across here, but these are at half steps. So I want to make sure we didn't get the 2 units of output. I'm sorry, 250. 250, and then 3, it's $1.92. I'm going to do the calculations. $1.67, $1.67, and $1.56 per unit. Okay, these are per unit values. Okay. So anyway, that is what's going on. I guess I could go over the actual line here. Take it back up here. Yeah, that's probably easier to do that.
But what is QL? What is that?
Quantity labor. Quantity input. Okay. So anyway, so that's the issue with regard to that. So you've got average fixed cost, average variable cost. Variable cost then is simply variable cost over total product. Variable cost over total product. Here, you really start with sort of the same. It's now the column 4 now. 4 was column 3 divided by column 2. On this previous category, now it's column 4 divided by column 2. And so as a result, what have we got going on here? Again, we have sort of an undefined unit here at the very beginning. Here we have, I've already done the math at 6.65. At 1 unit, at 2 units, it's $5, $5.71, $6.67, and notice it's on its way up now, $7.81. And I want to talk about this in a second here, talk about why this is happening. And it goes back to that curve that we drew before, and why that's important that we have that understood, okay? Again, the marginal driving the average. In this case, the marginal cost driving the average cost, both average variable and average total. And then the final category here is going to be relatively simple. There's nothing that's plain defined here. We simply take average fixed cost plus average variable cost. That's all it is. AFC plus ABC. Or you can do it as total cost divided by total product. It's going to be the same value. Well, it's the same way to get to the same number. So 625 plus 625 is 1250. 250 plus $5 is $7.50. $1.92 plus 571 is $7.69, and then I already done the math here, 8.33 and 9.38. Okay, so there's a lot going on here, and we don't tend to do a lot of big number charts in econ, but I think it's important that we do it for here just to sort of demonstrate what's happening, just so we can get into our heads what's happening. Okay, I want to go back to the graph here in a minute, and we talked about this idea that the marginal drives the average. That is, as the marginal goes down, as the marginal goes up, it is dragging both of these down. As they cross at different levels where the slope becomes 0, and then ABC starts on a positive slope, ATC starts on a positive slope. So everything to the left is a negative downward slope being dragged down here by this initial stage. Also, very small numbers of values in the denominator too, because we're not talking about much in the way of numbers. And then everything to the right, then at the intersection point is positively sloped. And so think about this: where does the marginal cost the average here? Right. In other words, where does marginal go up? When it really happens on average variable cost, it happens here between these two units. And so as a result, this is where average fixed cost or average variable cost has bottomed out, right? At 2 units, and as a result, it's now being sort of dragged upward, okay? And as a result, it's going upward from there. Because why? Because what happened with marginal cost? Marginal cost it crossed over. It's like the batting average, it crossed over. 470 to 833, it crossed over. It's dragging upward, and marginal cost is continuing. Yeah, this is marginal cost here. But that's not marginal. Well, that's the same. Yeah, it's the same category. Marginal cost. It's the same category here. Okay, all that cost. It's dragging it upward from there, but first it goes down, and then it goes up. Then goes an average total cost. It goes down, then it goes up, and it's on an upward trajectory from there. So it's important to know that these are real numbers that can be computed, particularly if you're interested in determining the values of these values over time. So I'm going to leave that up there so that we can have that, and we can look at it, and and use it over time. And again, what I'll probably do is I'll probably just post, just sort of post that as a screenshot, and I'll probably get to that here in a second. So one final thing I want to do here is talk about this. I want to the last bit, because I think I've talked about everything I wanted to, and I noted at the outset, and I've talked about before. Actually, there are a couple of terms I want to talk about here. So let me see. I'll put this up on the screen here, and I'll swivel the camera over that direction. Okay. And let's get the camera moving here. Okay, it takes a while. If that camera moves like really slowly across the room, so. Okay, so very last thing on these slides. Were It's the idea of marginal analysis and the idea of marginal product. And remember, this marginal product is a diminishing function. So we have to understand the diminishing function is what causes that sort of downward slope with regard to this whole picture. Okay. So what about this? So this is all this is a short run view here. Okay. So when we talk about these definitions here, we talk about the averages, and all these are posted in your slide package here. One thing I do want to talk about is this, and that's the idea of looking at the longer term time period here. Okay. This will be really the last that I want to. We're almost done here with talking about this particular chapter, but so right now this is a short run view, whatever that short run view is. Okay. But here's the thing: what if we had a very long tail on this? We had a total product curve, total product axis out here, and what have we got going on over time? Okay. What have we got going on over time as we are talking about this? So remember, we've got average total cost is composed of average fixed cost and average variable cost, right? So given that, what about when we know that in the long run, all costs are variable, right? So in the long run, all costs are variable, meaning that all these things can change, and they can change because the inputs can change. So if we start out with an average total cost curve, looks something like this. Simply, it's sort of a U-shaped sort of phenomenon. We'll call it ATC1. And then over time, we're going to change the inputs. So think about what's going on here. Think about the life over time. And again, the time period is not really that well defined, but we're saying it's some period longer than our period here. Okay. And I think we're getting some clarity here. Slides here, I think. Might make it markers aren't always as dark as they'd like to be. So we've got a downward sloping or sloping portion. But over time, what is the goal of the firm? Well, the goal of the firm is to maximize profit. And one way to do this is to keep increasing output over time. Now, obviously, you reach a point at which you don't want to do that so much, but you're going to increase output. But think about this: as you get going, eventually the cost is going to rise. And the reason it's going to rise is because it's that average variable cost element. Remember, within ATC, you've got two elements. You've got average fixed cost and average variable cost. Yes, average fixed cost is going down, but average variable cost is going up. In other words, think about what happens. You've reached a maximum point at some level where now your costs are rising as you produce more units. You've got a limited amount of space, and so as a result, you're leasing space off premises in order to store goods, or you're leasing 18-wheelers because you don't have enough of your own. Or you're paying a lot of overtime because you don't want to hire more managers. In other words, you've got sort of a limitation. So you need to sort of move to the next level. And so you move to the next level, and we'll call ATC2. And that is for the same, rather than produce this amount of output at this cost, you can produce this amount of output at this cost. And so as a result, there's that savings on a per unit basis because you move to some new level of output. And when that gets to onerous, you'll move on to the next level. ATC2 goes to ATC3, et cetera, over time. All these will change over time. And if you then can extrapolate over a very long time period, so here, all you're simply talking about here is, now your costs are beginning to rise, and so now at producing this level of output, you can get not this old cost, but this new cost. So you've got that amount of savings per unit, and the whole thing starts over and over again as you get the benefits of both operating leverage as well as a whole new set of inputs, and maybe you don't pay as much in the way of overhead and overtime, et cetera. So if we were to take a very long run view here and say, look, if we remember, these are graphs. These curves are graphs of functions. And functions are mathematical equations or relationships. So what about mathematical relationships? They can be added together. In fact, if we did add them together and we sort of summed all these up over a very long time period that's expected, we could sort of draw a curve here that looks something like that we'll simply refer to as the long run average total cost curve. Long run average total cost. Sometimes the T on all these are taken out and it's average cost. But remember, average total cost is unit cost. So sometimes the T comes out, but it's the same thing. Long run average total cost curve. This is the cost curve over very long time periods. And so there are really two stages that we're talking about here. And by the way, in reality, it may be that, and I'm just sort of simplifying this, but it could be many, 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 many units, different inputs as we get going here. But you've really got two stages that are going on here. And we've got something in economics. It may be a term that may be familiar to you. You may have heard it in some fashion, but it's this phenomenon here is something known as economies of scale. Of scale. That simply refers to declining unit costs, which is ATC, right? As output rises. Okay? As output, and make sure that you are familiar with this term because this is going to come up again and again, particularly in the next section of the class when we talk about market structure, particularly monopolies and oligopolies, which we don't worry about what those are yet. We will get there. But what I'm saying is that we're talking about primarily big businesses here. And one of the things about microeconomics and even accounting and finance in colleges is that we do tend to focus a lot on bigger businesses because they've got different sorts of realities that smaller businesses don't. Smaller businesses have all the problems big businesses have all the problems that smaller businesses do, but then they also have others that are starting to find on top of them, including this issue of scale. So it's declining, I should say unit, I wrote that wrong. Declining unit costs, declining unit costs as output rises. Declining unit costs as output rises. Hope I got enough coffee this morning here, so okay. Declining, so in other words, costs are going down. This is why, and I go back to this idea I talked about earlier, where big businesses can produce output at a much cheaper price and provide it to you at a much cheaper price because their cost is lower. Remember, cost is the value of the input, price is the value of the output. And so that price, that output value is so much less because it costs them so little to produce. What does it cost to make a pack of cigarettes? Not very much, right? The price is very high because a lot of it's taxes and markup and all that other stuff. And plus, it's an addictive product that people are willing to pay a lot for. But over time, though, these firms, these are very profitable firms. The tobacco industry is very profitable because it's so big. It doesn't take much. It's not a very high-tech product. And as a result, it doesn't take very much, doesn't cost very much to produce that level of output. You might say, well, why doesn't everybody do it? Well, it might be hard to get to what we call scale. It might be hard to get to scale. So if you're thinking, okay, why does everybody be in the cigarette business? Because it doesn't cost very much to make and you get the high prices. Well, it's because of the fact that those low costs are because of the fact they're producing gigantic amounts of scale and they're very heavily branded products. And so people are very loyal to the brand of cigarettes to the point where they will smoke one brand of cigarettes maybe their entire lives and don't even consider any other brand. I mean, I've known people who, if they don't have their brand, wherever they're trying to buy, they don't buy any at all until they get on down the road and find a place that does. And so we'll talk about that. So the answer to the question, why does everybody do it? It's because you can't get to scale quickly enough. And by the way, I know I saw an interview a few years ago with Elon Musk, who was the founder of Tesla, and he was asked why the price of Teslas were so darn high, 80,000 or whatever, 90,000 for a vehicle. And he said, because we haven't gotten to scale yet. We're trying to get to scale. As we do that, the price of Tesla will go down because our costs will go down. And the car industry is a perfect example of scale. And that is, why does it, why can you produce so many vehicles at such a low cost per unit? And they can do it because they've got they produce so many units. And if you're starting out, this is why you also have very few people entering the market, is because you can't get down to scale quickly enough. Okay, so that's an issue. Economies of scale. But what about this area here? Well, now you've got an area where now you've got costs rising, okay? And what do we call that area? Well, it's just the opposite, okay? Now, frankly, economies of scale are more common than this other kind, and there's a reason. I'll tell you why here in a minute, okay? So this area we call diseconomies of scale. And this is a real term, okay? Diseconomies of scale, and that is rising unit costs as output increases. Rising unit costs as output increases. So, okay, well now what is going on here? This goes totally against what you talked about a second ago. Well, you're also in a way different portion on the time slot here. And we may be talking about a very, very long difference between number of units between this region here and this region there, okay? So what might be happening? Why might a firm every unit of output they produce, they're raising the cost of production. Why would that happen? Well, some of the explanations for economies of scale is actually a very interesting phenomenon. And one of the explanations is sometimes firms get too big. They get too darn big and they become too unwieldy. They're too hard to manage. And because they're too hard to manage, their costs get out of control. They hire too many managers who, and again, managers, just like hourly workers, can bump into each other and have overlapping responsibilities and arguments. And sometimes managers are very unproductive. And that's a reality. And I came from the management world. And I know there are a lot of managers who don't really do very much, right? Particularly if nobody's watching. And they might not be watching because it's too much to watch. And the classic example of economies of scale, I think that the economics textbooks and academic literature for years was General Motors reached this point of that, where the firm was too unwieldy, it was global, too many time zones, couldn't really get people together for meetings and whatnot very easily. Lack of communication, too many business units. You had, think of all the different companies within GM under the fiefdom. You had Chevrolet, GMC Truck, Cadillac, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, probably missing Saturn. I mean, some of these are now gone. Like Pontiac is gone, Oldsmobile is gone. But that's because of the fact that the firm was just simply too unwieldy and it needed to break itself up. Now, by the way, they went into bankruptcy a few years ago, and that was no surprise to a lot of people because they were sort of the poster example of diseconomies of scale, a firm that had gotten way too big and way too unwieldy. And a lot of people have been arguing for a long time the company needed to scale it down. So what's going on here is you've got a firm that's too big and too unwieldy, and it's simply difficult to manage. Now, personally, I think what might be happening here is I think Wells Fargo might be an example of this, of a bank that's too hard to manage, or maybe their managers aren't very good. I don't know. But we hear over and over again about stories about Wells Fargo making pretty big mistakes. And banking is an industry I'm very familiar with. So, and these are things that shouldn't happen. And I think it's simply because there's just too much to manage. It's a firm that's been cobbled together, some of it voluntarily, some of it involuntarily, as the government added business units to Wells Fargo. And I think their costs are rising. It is not a particularly well-performing bank. And it's a bank that I used to have a lot of admiration for, but I think it's probably just simply too big. And this is what we're going to have in the financial world as these banks get bigger. We're going to really need a lot of attention to, are we really running out of room here and bringing costs up? And so one of the things about this is this then explains this whole financial maneuver called divestitures. That is where firms get rid of other firms that don't make sense, that no longer make any sense. A divestiture is simply when a firm splits off part of its business units, splits part of it away, doesn't need it anymore, it's got to get smaller. And this is, by the way, the trend in the business world right now is firms focusing on things that they do best and getting rid of things that they may do less best. And so they're selling off bits and pieces of themselves. And I know this is sometimes controversial because it does tend to raise the stock price and people think, oh my gosh, all you're doing is rewarding the shareholders and the workers are sort of left to their own devices under new management. Well, that may be sometimes the case. Sometimes it's not so much the case. Abbott Labs broke itself up into AbbVie and the old Abbott Labs, and they're both doing very well because they focus on different things. One is more research-based, the other is more production-based. And so this explains why companies will, and this is a very common trend where firms are simply splitting themselves up in order to focus on other things and to do better. Here, on the other hand, this is where we see most of the action because as firms grow, they get to scale. And this explains why firms, I'm moving on the other side here, explains mergers and acquisitions. And by the way, I really hate that term, mergers and acquisitions, because it's really not, mergers are very rare. Mergers are sort of this idea of two companies that basically get together and say, okay, we're now equal, right? But really it's an acquisition. It's one firm. I mean, the actual legal relationship is one company is buying into the company. That's what it is. But, sometimes people like the word merger because it's, it sort of helps. And so as firms grow, sometimes you can grow by buying other companies. And as you buy other companies, you get bigger, are able to grow and grow and grow. And you can lower your unit cost because you've now got redundancies you can take away. So if we go back to the banking example, this is one that I use a lot in my classes. Banks were buying each other with a frenzy throughout the 80s and 90s. Why did they do it? One reason, the explanation was economies of scale. Now you only need one computer system and one IT support unit, one accounting department, one finance department. All these areas that were duplicated, particularly staff functions, that is off the line production, accounting, finance, HR, all these can be now consolidated. So you can actually costs by being more streamlined by joining forces. And firms have been doing this for a very long time. This is not anything new. Sometimes the press will talk about these things like they just happened. This is some brand new event. Acquisitions have been going on since really the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Standard Oil got to be where it is through acquisition. They just went around buying other refineries. And that's how they got to become this giant. And we'll come back to the Standard Oil example a bit later because it really is sort of an interesting thing to talk about. So, okay. All right. So questions about that, economies of scale, this economies. I know there's a lot going on here. This is a very sort of a dense chapter. And I have one final bit before I wrap it up. And I was going to get to it last time, and I thought, no, I'm just going to wait and I'll talk about it now. And I do. And that's sort of talking about something which is going to come up again and again. And it's something that we're going to sort of take as sort of understood and sort of implicit. And that's the idea of what do we mean by capturing cost? What kind of costs are we capturing, and are we including what we call opportunity costs? So again, we go back to this idea of what is the purpose of the firm. Remember, sort of come back to the circular flow model and the actors. And we said that economic actors have maximizing behavior, or they exhibit maximized behavior. Households try to maximize utility and consumption. Governments try to maximize social welfare. Sometimes do a better job of that than others. But firms are looking to maximize profit. Well, what about profit? Okay. So what is profit all about? So again, we've talked about this before. Profit is simply the difference between total inflows, right? Total revenue, that is the sales of goods, inflows, minus total costs, which are outflows. That's not particularly complicated at all. These are all denominated in dollar figures. And we usually simply use the pi symbol to represent profit. Why pi was chosen, I don't know. I guess because the Greek P symbol, so small p. Okay, so difference between total inflows and outflows. But here's the thing. We think of profit as being really two elements. There's accounting profit, which takes into account total revenue minus total cost. I know we've talked a bit about this. I know I'm talking about, these are what we call explicit costs or accounting costs. These are costs which the accounting world recognizes as being recognizable to anybody in the accounting world. That is, they're verifiable, they're objectively measured. Two people can agree on them. It's not something that's hugely controversial as to what those costs are. But we're interested mostly in economics and what we call economic profit. So economic profit is what we're interested in, where it's the same basic equation. Total revenue minus total cost. But here, the total costs include not just the explicit, but also the implicit costs. And these are the opportunity costs. Implicit and opportunity costs are the same thing. Okay? Explicit and implicit costs are the same as opportunity costs, meaning that we will, if we're looking to make a decision in economics, we're looking at trying to include also the value of the next best alternative that we chose not to do, whatever the decision is that we're trying to undertake. Okay, and so as a result, economic profit, because it's got another layer of cost, economic profit is always going to be less than accounting profit. And then the question becomes, okay, if economic profit is less than accounting profit, then why does, and what about economic profit? Can it be negative? Well, it can be. It could be positive. Okay, it could be positive. It may be negative, or it may be zero. Or it may be negative, right? And you could still be operating. And the reason why is because it depends on the size of the opportunity cost. And so what a firm is looking to maximize is economic profit, okay? And that is taking into account the value of foregone opportunities, things that they could be doing. What is the next best alternative that we could be doing? And this is why sometimes firms will shut down operations, is because they realize that maybe they're not doing the best that they could do with what they've got. Maybe they are producing goods that no longer are that productive, that are producing that much profit. So as a result, let's shut that down. Let's do that which we do best and get rid of that which we don't do very well. And if we do that, then we raise economic profit because we then lower our implicit costs, opportunity costs come down. Now, if you want to know, is this a real thing or is this a false thing? Well, then let me just give you an example. I know I've talked about this before, but just as an example, let's think about this. Let's say that I've got about 5 minutes, so I think I can get this done here. But let's say you've got and let's say it's all past COVID here, and let's say it's all pre-COVID. Pre-COVID may complicate things. Let's say you've got a chef who is a high-class chef and earns a salary of $150,000, okay, working at a hotel downtown, right? And decides in 2011 to go out on his own and start his own firm. And so now, in his first year, he makes an accounting profit, right? So an accounting profit of, let's say, $50,000. Okay, this is now 2011. Well, here's the thing: what did he give up to get that $50,000? He gave up $150,000. And so as a result, what is going on here? He's actually $100,000 worse off. His economic profit, these brackets here mean negative, okay? That's all they mean, is negative. So economic profit here is negative 100,000. So he's actually $100,000 worse off economically because of the fact that he is giving up 150,000 in order to do what he's doing. I'm assuming the chef, this is the thing he does best. I'm assuming he's not a rapper or a baseball player or something like that, or a YouTube influencer or whatever. So he's actually a little bit worse off. Now, here's the thing. Why should you do anything if you're capturing costs that bring your economic profit negative? Well, it could be that by 2015 now, his accounting profit from an accounting standpoint, this is accounting profit here, is, let's say it goes now up to $500,000. And you've still got the same implicit costs of $150,000. Well, now he's better off because now he's earning more economic profit than he would ever have being an employee. And so as a result, his economic profit is positive. Okay? So it does make sense, but you've still got to capture that opportunity cost. This 150,000 is an opportunity, and I'll simply call opportunity / implicit cost. It's the same thing. Why it's implicit is because it's got to be sort of baked in, and it's understood to be there. It's just not usually broken out. In fact, the accounting world doesn't do a lot of breaking out of implicit costs usually. About the only time that I think I've seen it is if a firm maybe puts a footnote on a financial statement saying we had a fire at our tire facility in Dayton, and so we closed that down, and so this was a contributor to this much profit, but we decided not to rebuild, to focus on other things. Whatever. I mean, that's not an actual cost. I mean, it's a cost of something foregone. Okay. All right. So those are some examples of how this might work. Are there questions for me about implicit cost and all that, how that might work? Okay. Well, that does it for this chapter. So I think what we're going to do, I don't see too much value in getting into the next bit of the next chapter dealing with perfect competition. I think I'm just going to wait. So I think what we'll do is on Wednesday, just dedicate that class session, even though we may not be here the entire period, to talk about the exam and go over what to expect, questions. And I think it's important that, because some of this I know gets a little bit involved. I get that. Believe me, I have been sitting where you are, and so I know that. So if you have questions, bring them to class, bring them to the Zoom session. If you're watching with me by email or whatever, and I'll be more than happy to talk about what's going on. Even if you want to email me ahead of time, that way I have something to talk about in terms of a question, I can address it on Wednesday. Okay? Okay. Have a great rest of your day. I'll see you next time.